Revenge Girls Stories.
My name is Runa Brooks, and at 32 years old, I never imagined a Thanksgiving dinner would change my life forever. All those years of walking on eggshells around my mother Heather, hoping for approval that never came. That night, surrounded by neighbors and family friends, I believed things might finally be different. I had no idea she would use her toast to announce that I was her biggest mistake, or that after decades of silence, I would finally find my voice. Before I dive into this story, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button and subscribe if you want more stories about finding strength when you need it most. Growing up in suburban Denver with Heather and Weston Brooks as parents was like walking a tightrope without a safety net. Our brick colonial house on Elm Street looked perfect from the outside, just like our family Christmas cards with matching sweaters. But inside those walls, nothing I did was ever good enough for my mother. My father, always buried in his newspaper or working late, was physically present but emotionally vacant, leaving me alone to weather Heather's constant criticism. From my earliest memories, Heather found fault in everything about me. My grades were never high enough, my room never clean enough, my voice too loud or too quiet depending on her mood that day. When I brought home straight A's, she would immediately ask about the one quiz I had missed points on earlier in the semester. When other parents beamed with pride at school events, Heather sat with pursed lips, mentally cataloging my flaws to dissect later in private. I still remember my third grade science fair project. I had spent weeks creating a model of the solar system, carefully painting each planet and calculating the distances to scale. My teacher had been so impressed she entered it in the district competition, where I won first place. Most parents would have been ecstatic, but not Heather. As the principal handed me my blue ribbon, I spotted her in the audience, arms crossed, mouth tight. Later, in front of my teacher and several other parents, she pointed out that Jupiter was slightly misshapen and that my handwriting on the information cards was sloppy. The pride that had been bubbling inside me deflated instantly, replaced by the familiar ache of inadequacy. High school graduation should have been a celebration, but Heather made sure it became another exercise in humiliation. I had been selected as one of the student speakers, an honor I had worked hard to earn. That morning, I carefully styled my hair and put on the new dress I had saved up for my part-time job at the local bookstore. When I came downstairs, Heather immediately began criticizing. "Your hair looks frizzy," she said, reaching out to roughly tuck a strand behind my ear. "And that dress makes your shoulders look wide. Couldn't you have chosen something more flattering? Everyone will be looking at you." On what should have been one of the proudest days of my life, I sat on the stage, my speech cards trembling in my hands, hearing only her criticism echoing in my mind. Even after I delivered my speech to a standing ovation, Heather only commented that I had mispronounced a word and rushed through the middle section. The pattern was relentless. Heather needed to be the center of attention at all times, even if it meant diminishing her own daughter. At family gatherings, she would interrupt my stories to tell her own. If relatives complimented me, she would quickly change the subject or undercut the praise with a humorous story about one of my flaws. Her narcissism was so encompassing that even my achievements became somehow about her failure as a mother if she couldn't take credit for them. By the time I was applying to colleges, I knew I needed distance. I purposely chose University of California, San Diego, 8 hours away from Denver, turning down a scholarship to a school closer to home. The day my acceptance letter arrived, Heather made sure to mention that her friend Susan's daughter had gotten into Stanford. When I explained that UC San Diego had an excellent program for my major, she simply said, "Well, I suppose they have to accept someone." Those 4 years in San Diego were like coming up for air after nearly drowning. For the first time, I could breathe without waiting for criticism. I made friends who actually enjoyed my company, professors who praised my work, and slowly began to build the confidence that had been systematically dismantled throughout my childhood. I graduated with honors and secured a job at a prestigious marketing firm in San Diego, deciding to make the city my permanent home. But 8 hours of physical distance couldn't heal the emotional wounds. My relationship suffered as I brought my defensive walls and expectation of criticism into every interaction. My first serious boyfriend ended things after 2 years, gently explaining that he couldn't break through the barriers I had erected. "It's like you're always waiting for me to attack you," he said during our final conversation. "I'm not your mother, Runa." 3 other relationships followed a similar pattern. I would either become so desperate for approval that I lost myself completely, or I would keep people at such a distance they eventually gave up trying to connect. My engagement to Michael ended when I had a panic attack over choosing wedding invitations, terrified that whatever I selected would be wrong. He couldn't understand the depth of my anxiety, and I couldn't explain that in my experience, there was never a right choice. 5 years ago, at the suggestion of a concerned friend, I began seeing Dr. Martinez, a therapist specializing in family trauma. Those weekly sessions became my lifeline as I began to understand the toxic dynamics that had shaped my worldview. Dr. Martinez helped me see that Heather's behavior wasn't because I was fundamentally flawed, but because of her own insecurities and inability to form healthy attachments. It didn't excuse her actions, but it helped me begin the process of separating my self-worth from her assessment of me. Despite the clarity therapy provided, some stubborn part of me still yearned for a mother's love. Every few months, I would visit Denver, each time hoping that something might have changed. Each time I left emotionally battered, but still clinging to the fantasy that our next interaction might be different. 3 months ago, Heather had minor surgery to remove her gallbladder. With my father increasingly absent, now spending most of his time at his fishing cabin in the mountains, there was no one else to care for her. I took 2 weeks off work, despite an important campaign launch, and returned to my childhood home to help with her recovery. For a brief shining moment, things were different. Weakened by surgery and dependent on my help, Heather showed glimpses of genuine gratitude. She asked about my life in San Diego without immediately criticizing my choices. One evening, as I brought her tea, she even took my hand and thanked me for coming. That simple touch, without criticism attached, brought tears to my eyes that I hastily blinked away. But as her strength returned, so did the old patterns. By day 10, she was scrutinizing how I folded the laundry and suggesting I should do something about the fine lines appearing around my eyes. When I left to return to San Diego, her parting words were, "Maybe next time you visit, you can stay a bit longer. It's not like your job is that demanding." Despite this backslide, I left with renewed hope. Those few days of connection, however brief, proved that somewhere inside Heather was the capacity for maternal warmth. I drove back to San Diego convinced that with patience and persistence, I might eventually break through her walls. That hope is what made me accept her Thanksgiving invitation 3 weeks ago, believing that perhaps the holiday spirit and the presence of others might bring out the better version of Heather I had glimpsed during her recovery. How wrong I was. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening, as I was reviewing analytics reports for our newest client campaign. Seeing my mother's name on the caller ID usually sent a wave of anxiety through me, but I took a deep breath and answered with forced cheerfulness. "Runa," Heather said, her voice lacking its usual edge. "I was thinking you should come home for Thanksgiving this year." I hesitated, mentally checking my calendar. I had tentatively planned to spend the holiday with friends in San Diego, a tradition that had evolved over the past few years and involved significantly less emotional preparation than family gatherings. "I know you probably have plans," she continued before I could respond, "but it would be nice to have you here. I'm making my special cranberry stuffing." There was an unfamiliar warmth in her voice that caught me off guard. The Johnsons from next door will be joining us, and the Parkers. You remember Margaret and Walter, right? From church. The mention of guests was both reassuring and concerning. On one hand, Heather typically behaved better with an audience. On the other, she was skilled at subtle digs that only I would recognize as barbs, while appearing perfectly pleasant to everyone else. That sounds nice, I found myself saying, that eternal optimism overriding my better judgment. What can I bring? Just yourself, dear, she replied, using an endearment so rare from her lips that I nearly dropped the phone. Your father and I will handle everything. After we hung up, I sat staring at my phone screen, trying to process what had just happened. Heather had been almost nice. No criticism, no passive-aggressive comments, just a straightforward invitation. Could her surgery have sparked a genuine change? Or was this simply the calm before an inevitable storm? Despite my reservations, I requested the days off work and began planning for the trip. If Heather was making an effort, I would meet her halfway. I wanted to be prepared in every possible way to make this Thanksgiving different from our previous encounters. The weekend before Thanksgiving, I spent 3 hours searching for the perfect hostess gifts. I knew better than to bring food that might compete with Heather's cooking, so I selected a bottle of expensive Cabernet from a boutique winery and an artisanal chocolate tart from an award-winning San Diego bakery. Each choice was carefully calculated to be impressive, but not threatening to Heather's position as hostess. The day before my departure, I visited my favorite boutique to find an outfit that would withstand Heather's scrutiny. I finally settled on a burgundy sweater dress that was fashionable but not flashy, paired with modest heels and subtle gold jewelry. Professional but festive. Nothing that could be criticized as either too casual or overdressed. That same afternoon, I had my hair trimmed and styled, followed by a manicure. These weren't just beauty treatments, but armor against the inevitable assessment of my appearance. Every smooth strand of hair, every perfectly painted nail was one less thing Heather could find fault with. I even scheduled a facial, hoping it might preemptively address any comments about my complexion. My weekly therapy session with Dr. Martinez that Wednesday focused entirely on setting boundaries for the upcoming visit. Remember, Runa, Dr. Martinez said, her voice calm and measured. You cannot control how your mother behaves, only how you respond. What are some strategies you can use if things become difficult? We practiced responses to potential criticisms, timeouts where I could retreat to compose myself, and the radical concept that I could simply leave if the situation became too toxic. Your accommodation is a kind choice, not an obligation, Dr. Martinez reminded me. At any point, you have the right to protect your emotional well-being. I nodded, but we both knew there was a vast gap between acknowledging this right in the safety of her office and exercising it in the pressure cooker of family dynamics. The night before my drive to Denver, I met my friend Olivia for dinner. Over pasta and wine, I shared my conflicted feelings about the upcoming holiday. She sounded different on the phone, Liv. Almost kind. Maybe the surgery really did change her perspective. Olivia, who had witnessed the aftermath of countless family encounters, looked skeptical. I hope you're right, Sylvana. Just don't set yourself up for disappointment, okay? And promise me you'll call if things go sideways. My parents' door is always open if you need to escape. Back at my apartment, I packed my overnight bag, including an extra outfit in case something happened to the first. The gifts were carefully wrapped and cushioned, and my toiletries included both anxiety medication and my emergency self-care kit. As a final precaution, I made a hotel reservation in Denver that I could activate if needed. Experience had taught me to always have an escape route. As I packed, memories of previous holiday disasters surfaced unbidden. Thanksgiving 5 years ago, when I had spent hours making a pumpkin cheesecake from scratch, only to have Heather announce to the entire family that store-bought would have been less dense. Christmas 2 years ago, when she had given me a set of self-help books with titles like Dressing for Success and Why You're Still Single, each one a thinly veiled criticism wrapped in festive paper. Each memory reinforced the wisdom of having a backup plan. The 8-hour drive from San Diego to Denver the next day gave me too much time to think. I alternated between hope that this visit might be different and mentally rehearsing the protective phrases Dr. Martinez and I had practiced. I'm not comfortable with that comment. Let's change the subject. I need a moment to myself. Simple statements that felt like climbing Mount Everest when faced with Heather's disapproval. Fall foliage had peaked and was now fading along the highway, the brilliant reds and oranges giving way to muted browns and bare branches. The landscape seemed to mirror my own cautious transition from the vibrant optimism following Heather's surgery to a more subdued expectation for this reunion. As I turned onto the familiar streets of my childhood neighborhood, my stomach tightened with each passing block. The colonial houses with their manicured lawns and tasteful Thanksgiving decorations appeared so normal, so welcoming. No one driving by would guess at the emotional minefields hidden behind some of these doors. I parked in front of my parents' house, taking a final moment alone to center myself. "You are an accomplished, independent adult," I whispered, gripping the steering wheel. "Her opinion is just one person's view, not the truth." With those affirmations, I gathered my bags and gifts and approached the front door. Before I could ring the bell, the door swung open, revealing Heather in an immaculate cream sweater and tailored slacks, her silver blonde hair perfectly styled. "Runa," she said, her smile appearing almost genuine. "You made good time. Come in before you let all the heat out." Not exactly warm, but lacking the immediate criticism I had braced for. As I stepped into the foyer, Heather did something so unexpected I nearly dropped my bags. She hugged me. A brief, somewhat stiff embrace, but physical affection nonetheless. Confused but cautiously optimistic, I followed her into the house. The familiar scent of turkey and spices enveloped me, along with the strange new feeling that perhaps, just perhaps, this Thanksgiving might be different after all. The house was warm and filled with the aromas of roasting turkey, fresh-baked bread, and cinnamon from the simmering potpourri Heather always kept going during holidays. I followed her into the living room, where my father and the guests were gathered. Dad gave me a distracted half-smile before returning to his conversation with Walter Parker, a balding man in his 60s who had been my father's golf partner for years. "You remember the Parkers?" Heather said, gesturing toward Walter and his wife Margaret, a petite woman with a kind face framed by silver curls. "And these are our new neighbors, the Johnsons. They moved in last spring where the Millers used to live." Linda Johnson, a woman about my age with friendly eyes, stood to greet me, followed by her husband Paul, who looked to be in his early 40s. They both had that slightly uncomfortable air of people who sensed they had been invited into a situation more complex than a simple holiday dinner. "Runa works in advertising in San Diego," Heather said to the room at large, her tone making my career sound like a curious hobby rather than the executive position I had worked hard to achieve. "While their son," she continued, nodding toward the Johnsons, "just made partner at his law firm in New York, and he's only 34. And there it was. Not even 5 minutes in the door, and Heather had already managed to diminish my accomplishments while setting up an implicit comparison. I took a deep breath, remembering Dr. Martinez's advice to choose my battles. "Congratulations to your son," I said sincerely to the Johnsons. "That's quite an achievement." Linda smiled gratefully. "Thank you. We're very proud of him. Paul mentioned you work in marketing. That sounds fascinating." Before I could respond, Heather interjected. Runa, would you help me in the kitchen? I need to check on the appetizers. In the kitchen, the criticism I had been bracing for finally emerged. As I arranged crackers on a serving platter, Heather hovered over me. You're spacing them too far apart, she said, reaching around to rearrange my work. And your sweater looks a bit snug. Have you been stress eating again? I focused on keeping my breathing even. The sweater is designed to be fitted, Mom. And I've actually been working with a nutritionist as part of my new fitness routine. She made a non-committal sound and moved to check the oven. The Johnson's son just bought a house in the Hamptons, you know. Very successful. Married his college sweetheart last year. That's nice, I said, neutrally, knowing exactly where this was headed. Whatever happened with you and Michael? Such a shame that fell apart. He was from such a good family. The casual mention of my broken engagement from 3 years ago sent a familiar pang through my chest, but I was prepared for this particular attack. Michael and I wanted different things. He's actually engaged now to someone who's a better match for him. Well, Heather said with a sigh, some girls just know how to make it work. I suppose not everyone has that gift. I busied myself with the platters, refusing to take the bait. When I returned to the living room with the appetizers, I found Linda Johnson making a valiant effort at generating pleasant conversation. Runa, your mother mentioned you recently received a promotion. Tell us about that. It was a softball question, a friendly opening, and I felt a surge of gratitude toward this woman who clearly sensed the undercurrents in the room. Yes, I was made Senior Marketing Director last quarter. Our team just landed the Horizon account, which is a major technological innovations company looking to expand their consumer base. Senior Marketing Manager, Heather corrected from behind me as she entered with another tray. And the promotion really just because Janine went on maternity leave, wasn't it? Director, not manager, I said quietly but firmly, and Janine transferred to the West Coast office. It was a competitive promotion. An awkward silence descended until Paul Johnson, bless him, launched into a story about his disastrous first business presentation that had everyone laughing within minutes. As the conversation flowed around me, I excused myself to use the restroom, needing a moment to regroup. In the powder room, I leaned against the sink and studied my reflection. My carefully applied makeup was still intact, but the tension around my eyes was visible. I ran through one of the grounding exercises Dr. Martinez had taught me. 5 things I could see, 4 things I could touch, 3 things I could hear, 2 things I could smell, 1 thing I could taste. The exercise brought me back to center, reminding me that I was an adult with choices, not a powerless child. When I returned to the living room, I discovered Heather holding court with a story from my adolescence, one of the most humiliating moments of my teenage years, when I had tripped during a dance recital and accidentally pulled down part of the backdrop. You should have seen her face, Heather was saying, as the guests offered polite chuckles. Red as a tomato and frozen like a deer in headlights, the dance instructor had to physically pull her off stage. What she didn't mention was that I had been battling a fever of 101 degrees that day, but had been told I was being dramatic when I said I felt too sick to perform, or that she had refused to make eye contact with me for the entire drive home, her silence more devastating than any shouted criticism could have been. Mom loves that story, I said with a forced smile, accepting a glass of wine from my father, who had finally noticed my discomfort. Though I prefer to remember the recital where I stayed upright. The next hour unfolded in a similar pattern. Every time I began to relax into conversation, Heather would find a way to insert a subtle dig or bring up an unflattering anecdote. Her wine glass was refilled repeatedly, making her comments progressively less veiled. When the discussion turned to holiday traditions, I mentioned the Thanksgiving potluck I sometimes attended with friends in San Diego. I make cranberry orange scones that have become something of a tradition, I shared. thinking of the recipe I had perfected over years, one of the few areas where I felt genuinely confident. "Speaking of cranberries," Heather interjected smoothly, "I decided not to make your grandmother's cranberry sauce recipe this year. I found a much better one in Bon Appetit. Sometimes the old ways need improving upon." The statement was targeted perfectly. My grandmother's cranberry sauce recipe was one of the few family traditions I had genuinely cherished, something I had planned to contribute to this meal. I had even mentioned it during our phone call, but Heather had obviously decided to replace it without discussion. It was a small thing objectively, but it represented yet another erasure of my place in the family narrative. Paul Johnson, continuing his role as unwitting peacekeeper, asked about my work projects, giving me an opening to discuss professional topics safely removed from family dynamics. As I explained our latest campaign, I noticed my father actually listening with interest. This tiny acknowledgement felt disproportionately important, a crumb of validation I was still hungry for, despite everything. Heather, perhaps sensing this moment of connection, quickly redirected. "Runa always did talk too much about work. Some people define themselves entirely by their careers when they have nothing else going on in their lives." The Parkers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Walter tugged at his collar, while Margaret suddenly found her napkin fascinating. I saw Linda Johnson's expression shift from polite interest to concern, her eyes darting between Heather and me as she began to understand the true nature of our relationship. As Heather began arranging everyone for dinner, assigning seats with the precision of a military strategist, I felt the familiar sense of being a visitor in my childhood home. The dining room table had been extended to accommodate all 7 of us. With Heather and my father at opposite ends, I was placed directly across from Heather, positioned perfectly in her line of sight, with nowhere to hide. The final preparations proceeded with increasing tension. Heather criticized the way I carried the serving dishes, how I filled the water glasses, even the arrangement of the centerpiece I had adjusted. Each comment was delivered with a smile for the guests, but aimed like an arrow at my increasingly fragile composure. When we finally settled into our seats, surrounded by Heather's best china and the polished silver that only emerged for special occasions, I took a fortifying sip of wine and reminded myself that I had survived countless family dinners before. I could survive one more. What I didn't realize was that this particular Thanksgiving would be unlike any that had come before. The Thanksgiving table was a masterpiece of Heather's exacting standards. Bone china plates with gold trim set on top burgundy plat mats, each place setting perfectly aligned with polished silver and crystal water goblets that had been her mother's wedding gift. The centerpiece featured an arrangement of autumn flowers, miniature pumpkins, and elegantly curled dried leaves, flanked by tapered candles and silver holders. It was beautiful, intimidating, and very much designed to showcase Heather's impeccable taste. The first few minutes of the meal passed in that particular kind of relieved silence that falls when good food temporarily overshadows social tension. My father carved the turkey with surgical precision, while Heather directed the passing of side dishes with the authority of an orchestra conductor. "The turkey is perfectly moist," Margaret Parker commented, clearly trying to maintain a pleasant atmosphere. "And these mashed potatoes are divine, Heather. Is that a hint of garlic I taste?" Heather smiled, basking in the praise. "Yes, and a touch of rosemary infused in the cream before adding it to the potatoes. It's a technique I learned from that cooking class I took in Provence last spring. Runa could benefit from some cooking classes. The last time she tried to make the Thanksgiving dinner for her friends, she called me in a panic about the turkey still being frozen that morning." That call was 5 years ago, when I was hosting my first major holiday meal. I'd called seeking advice, not to be mocked, but Heather never passed up an opportunity to highlight my domestic shortcomings. "The turkey turned out fine in the end, And everyone loved the caramelized Brussels sprouts recipe I developed, I said lightly. Well, everyone has different tastes, I suppose. Some people are easily impressed. The meal continued with Heather growing increasingly irritated by small imperfections only she could detect. The dining room was too warm, then too cold when my father adjusted the thermostat. The water glasses needed refilling too frequently. The seating arrangement she had so carefully planned now seemed wrong because Paul Johnson was left-handed, and his elbow occasionally bumped against Margaret Parker's arm. I noticed her wine glass being emptied and refilled with concerning frequency. Heather was typically careful about maintaining a controlled image in front of guests, but tonight something seemed different. There was an edge to her that went beyond her usual critical nature. As the main course was winding down, Heather introduced a tradition that had been part of our family Thanksgivings for as long as I could remember. Before dessert, we always go around the table and share something we're thankful for, she announced to the guests. Since the Parkers and Johnsons are joining us for the first time, perhaps Walter would like to start. Walter Parker, looking slightly uncomfortable at being put on the spot, cleared his throat. Well, I'm thankful for good health this year. After my knee surgery last winter, being able to play golf again has been a blessing. Margaret went next. I'm thankful for our community, especially our church family, who has supported us through so many life changes. The Johnsons followed with relatively safe expressions of gratitude for their new home and welcoming neighbors. My father muttered something about the stock market performing well, barely looking up from his plate. When my turn came, I took a deep breath and decided to speak from the heart. I'm thankful for personal growth and the strength I found in challenging situations, and for the opportunity to be here today connecting with family. It was genuine, without being specific enough to make me vulnerable. Heather nodded, her expression unreadable. Then, instead of offering her own thanks, she stood unexpectedly, wine glass in hand. The candles cast flickering shadows across her face, giving her an almost theatrical appearance. Since we have guests, I'd like to offer a toast, she announced. This was a departure from our usual tradition, and I felt a prickle of unease at the back of my neck. When I look back on my life, Heather began, her voice carrying a slight slur that confirmed she had indeed had too much wine. I think about the choices I've made, the sacrifices, the things I might have done differently. She gazed around the table, making eye contact with each guest. I had such dreams when I was young. I could have traveled, could have had a career like Linda here. She nodded toward Linda Johnson, who shifted uncomfortably. Instead, I chose to be a mother, to create a beautiful home, to support my husband's career. My father stared fixedly at his plate, a muscle working in his jaw. Most of my choices I stand by, Heather continued, her gaze finally landing on me with laser focus. But my biggest mistake was her. The words landed like a physical blow. Around the table, everyone froze. Linda Johnson's eyes widened in shock, her hand instinctively reaching toward her husband. Paul Johnson suddenly found his plate fascinating, refusing to look up. Margaret Parker's hand flew to her mouth, while Walter tugged at his collar and stared at the ceiling as if searching for divine intervention. But Heather wasn't finished. The dam had broken on decades of thinly veiled resentment, and now it poured forth without filter. Do you know what it's like to pour everything into a child who never appreciates it, who rejects your guidance at every turn? Her voice rose slightly. I gave up my own ambitions to raise her, and how does she repay me? By moving to San Diego and coming home only when absolutely necessary? By making career choices that make no sense? By driving away perfectly good men who could have given her stability?
She gestured toward me with her wine glass, liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim. Look at her. 32 years old, and what does she have to show for it? No husband, no children, a rented apartment, and a job that keeps her too busy to maintain real relationships. Each word felt like a knife, expertly wielded to slip between my ribs with precision. My face burned with humiliation as Heather continued her litany of my supposed failures, from my appearance to my relationship history to my inability to maintain her impossibly high standards. Even the choice of dress tonight, she said, waving dismissively at my carefully selected outfit. Trying too hard as usual. That color washes you out completely, Runa. You've always had poor judgment about what flatters your figure.
The silence following her toast was absolute. No clink of silverware, no clearing of throats, just the sound of Heather's slightly labored breathing as she remained standing, a triumphant gleam in her eye as she surveyed the damage she had inflicted. I sat frozen, my lungs seeming to have forgotten how to draw in air. The burning in my face spread down my neck as blood roared in my ears. Time stretched and warped around me. I was simultaneously a child again, shrinking beneath Heather's criticism, and an adult woman being publicly eviscerated by the person who should have been her greatest advocate. My hands trembled against the tablecloth as Heather finally sat down, looking satisfied. She reached for the cranberry sauce as if she hadn't just detonated an emotional bomb, her expression daring anyone to acknowledge what had just happened. I glanced around the table, taking in the horrified expressions of the guests who were now trapped in our family dysfunction. Linda Johnson looked on the verge of tears. Walter Parker appeared to be calculating the fastest escape route. My father, predictably, had retreated completely, examining his wineglass with intense focus. Heather served herself another helping of stuffing, the silence stretching painfully until she looked up with artificial brightness. Now, who would like coffee with their pumpkin pie? In that suspended moment of silence, something crystallized inside me. Years of therapy sessions with Dr. Martinez replayed in my mind. We had discussed this exact scenario. The moment when Heather would go too far in front of witnesses, when the facade of familial normalcy would crack beyond repair. I had always feared it. Now that it had happened, a strange calm settled over me. I thought of all the times I had swallowed my pain to keep the peace, the childhood award ceremonies where I had blinked back tears at her criticism, the college graduation where she complained about the length of the ceremony rather than congratulating me, the countless holidays where I had smiled through barbed comments, returning to San Diego emotionally depleted, but still hoping the next visit would be different. I remembered a promise I had made to myself at 16, crying in my bedroom after another crushing interaction. Someday, I had vowed, I would stand up to her. Someday, I would find my voice. For 16 years, that someday had remained safely in the future. Dr. Martinez's words echoed in my mind. Your accommodation is a kind choice, not an obligation. I had spent a lifetime accommodating Heather's cruelty, absorbing the impact to protect others from witnessing the dysfunction, to maintain the illusion of a normal mother-daughter relationship. But accommodation had become complicity in my own diminishment. The realization was liberating. I was 32 years old. I had built a life and career I was proud of. I had friends who valued me. I had survived everything Heather had thrown at me over the years, and I would survive this too. With deliberate slowness, I placed my napkin on the table. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, waiting to see how I would react to this public execution of my character. Heather was watching too, a familiar gleam of satisfaction in her eyes, expecting my usual retreat into silence or perhaps a cheerful exit that would confirm her narrative of my emotional instability. But instead, I rose to my feet, mirroring her earlier stance. I picked up my water glass, not the wine,
wanting complete clarity for what I was about to say. The crystal felt cool and solid in my hand, grounding me in the present moment. "I'd like to respond to that toast," I said, my voice steadier than I had expected. The room remained perfectly still, tension vibrating in the air. "For 32 years, I've tried to earn your love, Mom. I've twisted myself into knots, trying to meet impossible standards that seemed to change whenever I got close. I've accepted blame for things that were never my fault. I've apologized for taking up space in your life." I took a measured breath, maintaining eye contact with Heather, whose expression had shifted from smugness to surprise. "What you just said hurts deeply, not because it's true, but because a mother should be the one person in the world who sees the best in her child, who champions her successes and supports her through failures. Instead, you've spent my entire life finding new ways to tell me I'm not enough." Heather's mouth opened, but I continued before she could speak.
"The marketing position you dismissed? I manage a team of 15 people and a multi-million-dollar portfolio of accounts. The apartment you disparage? It overlooks the Pacific Ocean, and I chose every piece of furniture in it with care. The relationship failures you mock? Each one taught me something about what I deserve in a partner, which is certainly not someone who treats me the way you do." My voice remained calm, factual, rather than accusatory. This wasn't about scoring points, but about finally speaking my truth. "I used to think if I just tried harder, achieved more, looked better, you would finally be proud of me. I now understand that your inability to celebrate my successes or support me through challenges has nothing to do with me and everything to do with you." I looked around the table, acknowledging the uncomfortable witnesses to this family rupture. "I apologize to all of you for being subjected to this tonight. No one deserves to have their holiday disrupted by such hostility." Returning my gaze to Heather, whose face had flushed with anger, I delivered the hardest truth of all. "I've spent years making excuses for your behavior, hoping that deep down you truly loved me, despite the evidence to the contrary. I've been your last defender, the only person still willing to see the best in you. But tonight, you just lost your last ally." I placed my glass carefully on the table, unwilling to slam it down in anger despite the emotion coursing through me. "I will not be continuing this pattern. I deserve better, and until you can acknowledge the pain you've caused and make genuine efforts to change, I need to protect myself by limiting our contact." Heather's expression transformed from shock to rage. "How dare you speak to me this way in my own home after everything I've done for you? This is exactly the kind of dramatic, ungrateful behavior I was describing." In the past, this counterattack would have sent me spiraling into doubt and guilt. Tonight, it simply confirmed the rightness of my decision. "That response tells me everything I need to know," I said quietly. "Thank you for the clarity." Without haste or drama, I collected my purse from the sideboard and my coat from the hall closet. The dining room remained silent behind me, the guests seemingly frozen in their seats. As I shrugged on my coat, I heard Heather's chair scrape back. "Runa, do not walk out that door," she called, her voice sharp with command, and a new note I had rarely heard from her: fear. I turned back briefly, meeting her gaze across the foyer. "Goodbye, Mom. I hope someday you can understand why this is necessary." To the guests still seated at the table, visible through the dining room doorway, I offered a small smile. "Please enjoy your dessert. The pumpkin pie is excellent, I'm sure." The sound of my heels on the hardwood floor echoed in the silent house as I walked to the front door. Behind me, I could hear Heather beginning to construct a narrative, her voice rising with indignation. "You see how she is, so sensitive, so unwilling to hear the truth. This is exactly what I've had to deal with." The November air hit my face as I stepped on the porch, cool and clean. I took a deep breath, feeling the constriction in my chest begin to ease. My hands trembled slightly as I unlocked my car, the adrenaline of the confrontation still coursing through me. As I pulled away from the curb, I glanced in my rearview mirror. Through the dining room window, I could see Heather gesturing animatedly, likely spinning my departure into further evidence of my deficiency. But for the first time in my life, I felt no compulsion to return and defend myself. Her opinion, which had dominated my self-perception for decades, suddenly held no power over me. I drove away from my childhood home with no intention of returning under current circumstances. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, it was truly mine to navigate. The 20-minute drive to the hotel passed in a blur. My body was physically present, making all the correct turns and stops, while my mind replayed the evening in continuous loops. Only when I parked in the hotel garage did the emotional impact fully hit me. My hands gripped the steering wheel as the first tears came. Not the familiar tears of hurt and inadequacy, but something different. Relief, release, the overwhelming sensation of finally setting down a burden I had carried for as long as I can remember. I allowed myself this moment of emotional catharsis before checking into the hotel. The front desk clerk gave me a curious look, likely noticing my reddened eyes and the fact that I was checking in on Thanksgiving evening, but maintained professional courtesy. In my room, I kicked off my heels and sat on the edge of the bed, feeling strangely weightless. My phone vibrated with an incoming call. I braced myself for Heather's name to appear on the screen, but instead saw Jessica, my oldest friend from high school who had remained in Denver. "Sylv, are you okay?" Her voice was concerned. "I just got the weirdest text from Paul Johnson's wife, something about a dinner disaster at your parents' house." The unexpected connection to someone who knew my history was all it took for the full story to pour out. Jessica listened without interruption, making occasional sounds of outrage on my behalf. "That's horrific, even for your mom," she said when I finished. "Where are you now?" "The Marriott downtown. I had a contingency plan." "Of course you did." Her voice softened. "Listen, why don't you come over? Thanksgiving at my place is messy and loud with the kids, but it's warm and there's plenty of food left. No one should be alone in a hotel room tonight, especially after that." I hesitated only briefly before accepting. The thought of human connection after such isolation was irresistible. An hour later, I found myself surrounded by Jessica's chaotic, loving family. Her 2 children showed me their artwork while her husband piled a plate with leftovers. It wasn't picture perfect, but it was genuine, and the contrast to the sterile perfection of Heather's table couldn't have been more stark. Later that night, back at the hotel, I checked my phone to find 3 missed calls from an unknown number and a text from Linda Johnson. "I'm so sorry about tonight. What your mother said was unforgivable. If you need anything while you're in town, please let us know. You handled yourself with incredible grace." That small validation from a virtual stranger meant more than I could have expected. Someone else had witnessed Heather's behavior and recognized it as wrong. My reality was confirmed. The unknown number turned out to be my father calling from his rarely used cell phone. When I called back the next morning, his voice was hesitant, almost embarrassed. "Your mother is quite upset," he began, his typical opening in any conflict. "I imagine she is," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. An uncomfortable silence stretched between us. "What she said was inappropriate," he finally offered, an understatement so vast it was almost laughable. "It was cruel, Dad, and it was just the visible part of a pattern that's existed my entire life." Another pause. "I know." Those 2 simple words contained decades of his own complicity through silence. "She wants you to come back for the rest of the weekend as planned, to talk things through." "I can't do that. Not now. Maybe not for a long time." He sighed, a sign of resignation rather than surprise. I understand. Safe drive back to San Diego. That was the extent of his response. No defense of me, no promise to address the situation with Heather, just acceptance that I would remove myself rather than him having to confront the dysfunction. It was disappointing, but not surprising. As I prepared to check out of the hotel, my phone lit up with a barrage of texts from Heather. They ranged from rage, "How dare you embarrass me in front of the neighbors," to self-pity, "After all I sacrificed for you," to attempts at manipulation, "Your father is very disappointed in your behavior." I read them with a strange detachment, seeing the emotional hooks that would have snagged me in the past, but now hung empty in the air. After careful consideration, I blocked her number. It wasn't a permanent decision, but I needed space to process without her voice in my head. The drive back to San Diego was cathartic, filled with moments of anxiety about what I had done, alternating with a growing sense of liberation. My first therapy session with Dr. Martinez after Thanksgiving was intense but validating. "You set a boundary that was long overdue," she said, her expression thoughtful. "How does it feel a week later?" "Terrifying," I admitted, but also right. Like I finally stopped pretending a burning house was just a little warm.
We spent the session exploring the guilt that still lingered. Not guilt for what I had said, which had been truthful and measured given the circumstances, but guilt for not having said it sooner, for allowing the dynamic to continue as long as it had. "You did what you needed to do when you were ready to do it," Dr. Martinez reminded me. "Emotional readiness can't be forced or scheduled." Returning to work provided welcome distraction. My boss, Rachel, noticed something different immediately. "You seem more present," she observed during our weekly check-in. "Whatever happened over Thanksgiving, it looks good on you." I shared a simplified version of events, and her response was unexpectedly supportive. "Family boundaries are crucial. Take whatever time you need if things get overwhelming." The weeks following Thanksgiving brought escalating attempts from Heather to re-establish contact on her terms. When blocking her number proved insufficient, she began recruiting family members as messengers. My Uncle David called in early December, his tone carefully diplomatic. "Your mother is very hurt, Runa. You know how she is. She expresses herself poorly sometimes, but she loves you in her way. Christmas is coming up, and it would mean a lot to everyone if you could just call her, maybe apologize for walking out and move past this unpleasantness." The old Runa would have capitulated for the sake of family peace. The new Runa stood firm. "I'm not apologizing for protecting myself from verbal abuse. I'm open to reconciliation if Mom is willing to acknowledge her behavior and work on changing it. But I won't pretend everything is fine when it's not." Uncle David's disappointed sigh was identical to my father's. "Families are complicated, Runa. Sometimes we need to be the bigger person." "I've been the bigger person for 32 years, Uncle David. It's someone else's turn." As Christmas approached, the absence of holiday planning with my parents created both anxiety and relief. For the first time, I wouldn't be making the pilgrimage to Denver to endure Heather's criticism of my gifts, my appearance, my life choices. Instead, I accepted an invitation to join friends for a ski weekend in Colorado, a new tradition unburdened by past expectations. The holiday itself wasn't without moments of grief for the family relationship I had always wanted but never had. Yet, alongside that grief was a new sense of possibility. Without the constant drain of trying to earn Heather's approval, I found new energy to invest in both my career and personal relationships. The promotion that Heather had dismissed led to even greater opportunities, and I developed a leadership style based on constructive feedback and genuine recognition, the direct opposite of Heather's approach. My personal life underwent similarly positive changes.
I met someone who saw my boundaries as healthy rather than threatening, who understood that my caution came from experience rather than coldness. If you've ever had to set difficult boundaries with family members, I'd love to hear your experience in the comments below. How did you find the courage to speak your truth, and what helped you heal afterward? Please like this video if my story resonated with you. Subscribe for more content about personal growth through difficult experiences, and share with anyone who might be struggling with similar family dynamics. Remember that your worth isn't determined by others' ability to see it, and that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is walk away from relationships that diminish rather than nurture us. Thank you for listening to my story, and I wish you strength on your own journey toward authentic living.